Welcome to the Author's Den, a place where we encourage reading and writing, a place where you can meet authors and book illustrators, a place to get your questions answered about writing, publishing, and promoting your book. Hello and welcome to the Author's Den. I'm your host, Mike Talley, and with me today is my guest, Mayor Ken Siver, Mayor of the City of Southfield. Ken, good to have you with us.
Good morning.
I know it's an early morning. Thanks for coming out. Yeah, I've been wanting to sit down and talk with you for quite a while. I've enjoyed your previous writings, and you've got a new book that we're going to be talking about, so I look forward to that. But tell me a little bit about yourself. Where were you born? Where did you go to school?
I was born in Hackensack, New Jersey, a suburb about 5 miles from Manhattan, and went to all through school there and came out to Michigan when I was 17 to attend Oakland University. Graduated from there, moved to Southfield, was teacher and administrator in Southfield schools for 45 years. Ran for city council in 2001. Have served on city council ever since and was elected mayor in 2015.
It's been great to watch your career, by the way.
Thank you.
And I've been very interested in the things that you choose to focus on. When you were young, did you read a lot, or?
Oh, I loved reading history, either historical novels or biographies. In Hackensack, the Johnson Public Library had a whole series of books on heroes in American history, and there must have been 40, 50 of them. And I would take every one of those out and read them. So I, remember reading about Admiral Perry or Stephen Decatur. The whole range of in different times in history.
Was there a particular author again? Some more authors?
No, not really. I would read something like All Good Men or Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, or of course I devoured Gone with the Wind when I was a kid. That was a fascinating story to me. But as I got older, I was more interested in nonfiction than fiction, and I have a history degree, taught social studies, English and journalism. So writing and history were always in the background.
When I first came to Southfield, I lived here for a while, and then when I started working for the city, I made it a point to do some homework on the demographics and a little bit of the background. I found some of the writings that you did in the past very helpful.
Right.
And then after that came I was aware of the history of the city of Southfield. I really enjoyed that book. And especially since it had pictures of old police and fire and things like that, I really enjoyed that. Tell us a little bit about the new book.
Okay, but just first,
Sure.
If I may, I want to go back on the other books.
Sure.
One of them is still available. The History of Our City in the 50th Year. It's available through the either Historical Society, and the proceeds go to the Historical Society, or through the front desk in the lobby, and those proceeds go to the Public Art Fund. I'm not receiving any funding from these. You don't make money writing local history, and it was really just a thing of interest and love to do that. But I wrote a book on the school system and the profound changes in American life. It's called The Crucial Decades, or Southfield Faces the Crucial Decades, the growth of a city and its school system in following World War II. And Southfield exemplified what the profound changes in American life following World War II. Between television stations and bowling alleys and freeways and all-electric homes, Northland, the world's first modern shopping center. Then I wrote guides for classroom teachers to teach Southfield history, and I edited the Martin Luther King a book and wrote part of that on the 30th anniversary of the Martin Luther King Peace Walk or Task Force, and then the 50th anniversary book, which is still available. And we hope to sell the remaining copies.
They all have a history in them, though.
Oh yeah, they're all the others are Southfield history related. So this is history too, this latest book.
How is this one different than the others?
Well, this one's very personal. It's about my great-grandfather, who was a nefarious character, who traveled the world. And I remember as a child, his children, my great-aunts, my grandmother, and uncle, great-uncle, plus my father, talking about him. And you know, the stories were interesting. The thing I didn't understand, they never told me about the scandals. They kind of glossed over. But I didn't understand why a man who's a doctor would give up that career. Of course, he didn't have a degree.
Let's back up a little bit. What's the name of the book? And
the book is called An Uncommon Criminal: The Extraordinary Life of Edwin Turner Oswald Destin, and it's written by my sister Noelle and myself.
Let's talk a little bit about your sister. How does she get involved with this?
Well, back up a little bit how this all came about. Our great-grandfather left a journal. And it appears to us that the last entry in the journal is 1899. He was born in 1838. And it appears that he rewrote the journal at some point. He had kept notes. And anyhow, we theorized that because it was totally, there is nothing, he paints himself as this dashing good guy, and there's nothing, none of the scandals or arrests that occurred are in the book or in his journal. And so when my great aunt Ethel passed away, she left me all her family memorabilia and history materials. And being a historian, I think she picked me because she knew of my interest in history and family history. So she had survived her sisters and brothers, so she was 88. And she left it to me. I organized all the materials. She lived in Florida. They had that kind of humid smell, musty smell that paper gets in Florida. And so I preserved all of it, cleaned it up, organized it. And I really didn't have time to do anything with it, so it sat in 3 boxes at home and in a closet for over 25 years. And my sister started, she had worked as a librarian and archivist, and she's a conservator. She works on archaeological digs. So she's got this whole background in research. And she decided that she wanted to get back into genealogy. And so she started asking me to look at things, and you know, it's family history, sure. And then she decided that she would transcribe the journal. It had been transcribed once, but it was typewritten by Aunt Ethel. So she rewrote it, or reformatted it, transcribed it, and she did, of course, in as a Word document. And then she created a chronology, and she began fact-checking. And sure enough, people and places he named, she could prove that he was there. But what started to come out was, it wasn't all good. There were arrests, there were jail breaks, there were skipping bond, and a whole number of other things. So that and it was just peeling this away, layer by layer by layer.
Interesting character.
Yeah, he was a very interesting character.
And was this your great-grandfather?
Great-grandfather, right. On my father's side, it was my father's grandfather.
What surprised you the most when you started doing the research?
Well, I had heard, as a kid, my grandmother always liked to say how, I think maybe it was to try and get us to behave better, I don't know. But my grandmother always used to remind us that we were, the Oswald Destins were a noble family. There was we were shown a family crest. Of course, ETO, Edwin Turner Oswald Destin created that crest, but that didn't matter. And that we were descended from British nobility, and we should carry ourselves better.
Behave.
Yes. I mean, there were 5 of us. We were a little rowdy, all a year apart. So,
what an interesting person! And you're finding all this many years later. Where did all this take place? Where did he live?
Well, he grew up in Cheltenham, England. He was born there. His father was an alcoholic. His father and had a very mean temper when he drank, but otherwise he was a holy man, a believer. He married his father had gotten into some trouble as a teenager, some vandalism. We found arrest records for his father. And, anyhow, he married a widow, and the widow had 2 teenage children, and the widow was 10 years older than him. And the widow's husband, deceased husband, had been in the British Navy, and so he got a pension. And we theorized that probably that made her an attractive woman because she had a steady source of income, a pension from the government. So he marries her, 10 years older than him, and before long she's pregnant, and then the teenage daughter is pregnant. And so at one time there were 11 children in the house, and he was impregnating both his wife and his stepdaughter. And so my great-grandfather's mother was actually his stepsister. So as a teenager, he, late teens, around 19, he joins the British Artillery and is trained as a gunnery in gunnery school, and is sent to the island of Malta. But this is a guy that's very restless. So, and at the time, Malta was a British protectorate. It had been ruled by the French. Napoleon had taken the island. The Maltese did not like French rule. They preferred the protection of Britain. So basically, if as a soldier, if you were sent to Malta, you were just on guard duty every day. It was very routine. So he gets transferred back to England on the Isle of Wight and deserts. And then he goes back home, meets a young woman, marries her, and next thing you know, they're off, after working in London for a while, they're off to Australia because the Australian Immigration Society was looking for people to come and settle there that had particular skills. Now, he was not really skilled, but he passed himself off as a ship surgeon. He had no formal education. He had observed, he was fascinated with medicine and had a rudimentary knowledge. He hung out in a hospital, Glower Street Hospital in London, and some doctors kind of took him under their wing, thinking that maybe he would, because he was very bright. So he learned some of the rudiments, but of course didn't have a medical degree. Lands as a ship surgeon, and also has been schooled in massage and hydrotherapy. So he goes to Australia, hops all around Australia, but of course there's every city he's in, there's a story and a reason why he's got to move on to another city. And I don't want to go into all of that.
Yeah. I have a feeling that there's a lot of stories about everywhere he went.
Yeah. Just to fast forward, he ends up in New Zealand, San Francisco, Hawaii, New Guinea, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, New York City a number of times, back in Europe, Germany, Canada, upstate New York. I mean, he's on the move a lot.
I'm kind of curious, how is he passing himself off at this time? What profession is he saying?
Well, a lot of people called him doctor. He was also, he had a school of massage. He was in New York City that he did quite well with and made quite a bit of money, training people in the art of massage and hydrotherapy. Even so, there were warrants out for his arrest. He was advertising his business in Manhattan and nobody came and got him. Anyhow, so he was referred to as either Professor Osbaldeston or Dr. Osbaldeston. And at the same time, he created this whole persona of being a war hero. And people believed him. There's a point, for instance, he says he marched with Garibaldi. Garibaldi was a very, very popular figure. Matter of fact, when Garibaldi comes to London, more people come out to see him than see the Queen Victoria. And so the royals kind of asked Garibaldi to leave because he was sort of upstaging the Queen. And anyhow, Garibaldi was this dashing figure that had freed and united Italy. So that was one of his stories. He talked about being part of the, also very fascinating to people was the story of the Crimean War and the Light Brigade. And he claimed to be a captain with 80 men under his command.
The way you say this, he claimed to be. So a lot of these stories are up for grabs. You're not really sure whether they happened or not?
Oh, they didn't happen.
They didn't happen, okay.
No, we know where he was. But other people didn't know where he was. And so he'd tell these stories. And of course, if anybody did some fact checking, as we did, you'd know that he wasn't in the Boer War. He wasn't in the Boxer Rebellion. He wasn't in the American Civil War. He claimed to be an agent in Bermuda for the for President Lincoln. And all of these things that conflict in the timelines. Plus, we have traced him since he joined the British Army, the Royal Army. So we know his whereabouts. We did this chronology. And again, he in his journal, he names people and places. And we can verify, for instance, in San Francisco, city directories, absolutely. He treated this woman. She's in the directory that he names. A duel he got into, that person existed. The address of the rooming house existed. So it was all fact and fiction.
Well, how old was he when he passed away?
He was almost 91.
So he had a long life.
Mm-hmm.
What was he doing towards the end of his life?
He had retired to Asbury Park, New Jersey, and he became a town character there. And on Memorial Day, he'd be out every year selling poppies for the war veterans. He would do. He'd love to tell entertain the little kids, and he'd tell stories, and he'd take them and they'd plant gardens. And he'd walk around town, always well-dressed, extremely well-mannered, and he wore this Crimean War medal, which we have. People believed him, and he became an endearing character. He led the, every year Asbury Park had a baby parade. It was one of their summer activities, and he led the parade.
That's great. Are any of these items in your book at all? Do you have pictures or?
Oh yes, yes. The medal, tons of newspaper clippings. Mm-hmm. He became a celebrity. So when he died, for instance, the New York Times wrote an editorial about him. There was a terrific windstorm, might have been a hurricane, hit Asbury Park, New Jersey, and he was knocked down. That was a news story. He accidentally drank some poison. He thought it was some bitters to settle his stomach, and it was something else. That was a news story. He decided that he didn't want to, when he died, he wanted to have an inexpensive burial. So it's a news story about him shopping for coffins and undertakers.
For his own? Yeah,
for his own passing. You know, the guy sneezed, somebody wrote about it. And the reporters in Asbury Park Evening Press said, he makes great press. You know, he's highly quotable. And so, you know, even today in life, we have people that, what talent do they have? But they're celebrities just because the media follows them. You know, somebody like Paris Hilton.
And they can get a good soundbite every now and then.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm kind of curious, you know, talking about how lauded he was, and at the same time, you mentioned that he was a criminal. How does that fit together? What was going on?
Well,
he had some good PR.
First of all, he was a master promoter. He was very good at self-promotion. He understood marketing, and when every new town he moved to, and he moved a lot, the first thing he'd do was go to the newspaper office and announce his arrival. And he carried with him a valise full of testimonials about how wonderful he was. For instance, when he lands in Australia, he gets passengers on the boat to say, you know, what a wonderful ship surgeon he was. And he carries these around. You know, it was very, again, 19th century, there were many more newspapers, and it was very common to report on new arrivals in town. And he would say, I'm going to be setting up a massage studio, or I will be opening a hydrotherapy practice, or whatever. He also went around doing lectures and demonstrations on mesmerism and hypnosis and ventriloquism and so on. And he'd put on these shows, and he'd have billboards or placards printed and hand them out, and rent out a hall and perform for people. He was a great showman.
Does any of this carry through to your life at all, Ken?
No.
Well, I know that you're a public figure, and that you're out and about in front of a lot of people right now. Sounds to me like though you handle it totally differently than he did.
I am much more humble, and I don't, I mean, I shudder at the things that he did. And as I said, it took me a couple of years to decide that I did not want to glorify him. And I think what we've done is, for a guy that was constantly masquerading, and he was a master con artist. You know, he would just suck you in, because you know, for instance, in London, he shoplifts a pair of socks, and he goes to court. And the judge lets him go because he speaks well, he's well dressed, and he's got money in his pocket. And he says, "Oh, I had some sunstroke. I didn't realize, I had a fall, and my memory." And the judge says, "Okay," and lets him go. And the stories go on and on and on like this. How he convinces people to let him go, let him off.
He had a way with people.
He had a way, and they believed him. And I'm sure for a judge in London, a shoplifter, would not have come into court presenting himself the way Professor Osbaldeston did. And so the judge obviously had, was, I would say, had some bias probably from the typical shoplifter that he would deal with in court.
And this person didn't look anything like that.
Exactly.
I know I could talk to you a long time about all the stories about him, but I'm also kind of curious about the whole idea of the way that you wrote the book and what was involved with it and some of the publishing aspects. Can we talk a little bit about
Sure.
that? You said that it took a long time to finish this book. What were the big things to overcome?
Well, there were gaps, and we continued. My sister and I have to give her credit. She has better research skills than I do, and had, with a library science background, she was a little more equipped to dig deeper and deeper, and just had a little more resources. And she also had more time. As a conservator and working on archaeological digs, in between her gigs, she'd have time off, and also her schedule took her all over the world. I mean, she worked in South America, Middle East, Spain, London, Ireland, Singapore, various places that she had assignments on. So, for instance, she went to Australia and researched the archives there. She used to have a home base. She's now headquarters out of Berkeley, California, but at the time, for many years, she was headquartered in London. So she would, on her free time, weekends or whatever, she would go to these parishes and research parish records. So she was gathering all this stuff. And then she kept sharing it with me, and it was fascinating. But as we started to peel it back, and again, the fact and fiction, and then find out, we were horrified to find out that his mother was his stepsister, because in the parish records, they didn't tell the whole story, that they had invented some things. And then in other document, the birth record in the parish, the baptismal records, things differed, and then the census tracts. My sister
A lot of homework went into this.
Yeah, tons. The book is very heavily researched and footnoted. Everything that's in the book can be attributed to some source. Originally, it was her research was, this is what he said, this is the chronology, and this is what we found. And I said, that's really not very readable. We need to put him in his world setting. So what I did was I broadened the story of his life, and what was, for instance, he goes to Australia. How does he get there, and why would he get free passage to Australia?
You put it in a context of some type.
Yeah, exactly. The context that Australia had started as a penal colony, and now they were looking for people with skills to build a more viable society. And so he passed himself off to get there. So all of these episodes in his life, I broaden to the context of the times, a fuller background of how this came to happen.
He sounds like a really interesting character.
He was.
Was there something that you wanted the audience to get from the book?
I just think it's history and it's a biography. I think in particular, I just thought, it took me a while to reconcile the terrible things he did, including murder, and just how someone goes from working class England, which was, basically most people were trapped in Victorian society in a very rigid class system, and how he gets out of that. But also, I delve into his personality. The thing that had me wondering was, how do you rectify? You've got to know right from wrong. How do you justify doing the terrible things you've done? And what he suffered from was narcissistic personality disorder. And he would rationalize, he had a very high sense of self. He had mood swings, like anybody that suffers from a great degree of narcissism. They are the greatest, they're the best, they always have to be recognized, and then they have their depression, where they have moments of I'm not all that, but then he springs back up, and so
I wonder what it would have been like if he'd have been able to tweet back then.
Yeah, exactly. He certainly had alternative facts. Very, very interesting, because he was a writer, and really he could turn a word. For a guy that was basically self-educated, his spelling wasn't the greatest, but of course, again in the times, there were lots of variable spellings, so it wasn't uncommon to misspell words, but he could really turn a word.
I know that you're a really busy person. I know that you're involved with boards and commissions and the city and schools still. Mm-hmm. How did you find the time to do this? Did you have a routine or regimen that helped you?
No, I am very good at time management. I always look for efficiencies. I always like being busy and engaged in things. People have said to me a whole number of times, "Don't you just want to retire? Like what? Go out into a pasture somewhere?" No, I believe if you're, regardless of your age, you should be mentally engaged and physically engaged with the world. So I was doing this. My sister would come to visit, and we'd work together. But most of it was done back and forth through emails and PDFs, and we just were constantly communicating back and forth.
Rewrites.
Yeah, and rewrites. And then I took early drafts to several people who gave us some good critical opinion. And my sister and I had, I think probably the one friction point that we had was we have differences in writing style. And I prefer, as a journalism teacher and somebody with a journalism degree, I prefer AP style rules. She's in an academic world, she prefers Chicago style. And I find that cumbersome.
Is one more strict than the other?
Yeah, oh yeah, and many more rules in Chicago style, and they're baffling sometimes. And AP style is just it's more, to me, it's a more modern, easier use of style rules, everything from capitalization, punctuation, use of numerals. It's what newspapers.
More conversational,
right.
you mean, or more
yeah,
modern?
it's just a more modern, less rigid. And it's used by newspapers and print media a lot. The Chicago style is used in academia. Many research documents follow Chicago style. So that was the push-pull in this whole project between my sister and I. But we got beyond it, obviously. So we went back and forth on. That was probably the worst part of it. We survived each other's. In the end, I conceded to Chicago style, kicking and screaming. But then we also had, I hired an editor just to conform to style, not to content. And the editor even corrected some of her interpretations of Chicago style. Any style manual, the English language, things can be interpreted very differently.
Well, how did the publishing come about?
Well, originally I investigated some self-publishing companies, and I found that they had a lot of restrictions. They would do things that appealed to me, like do marketing and so on, and do an ebook, but there were limits on size. I deliberately picked this size because of all the illustrations. There are 188 illustrations in this book. He was very vain, a part of his narcissism. So as you can see on the cover, he loved dress up. He loved costumes. He loved, here he is, either, we're not quite sure, as an officer or a band leader, I'm not sure, a doctor, the family man, decorated with honors. He frequently dressed in tuxedos and so on. And that was all part of his, facade and persona. But anyhow, back to the publishers, they wanted to limit the number of illustrations. They wanted to do, a lot of them wanted to do a portrait book. I wanted landscape.
Layout.
Yeah, and for a layout. So finally I just said, you know what, we'll just self-publish this. The book is available on Amazon at BookBeat in Oak Park. I didn't do this to make money. Matter of fact, I've heavily subsidized it because to publish a book like this and with a short run, it's not financially feasible.
Have you got any plans for promotion?
Well, like I said, it's on Amazon. Where I'm spare time, I'm talking it up. I put it on Facebook several times. We've sold some copies on Amazon already. One just this morning, I just keep talking it up. I just got an email from somebody that said, how do I get your book? Somebody locally.
Good, good. As you describe him, I hear a real mixture of emotions. It sounds like on one hand you kind of admire his resourcefulness, and at the same time, it sounds like you have some contempt for him.
Well, I don't approve of anything that he did. Most people don't like braggarts, and he was. And basically, he was very calculating, very smooth, and so he would take you in, and then he'd steal from you. If you didn't agree with him, he could be. He assaulted people, verbally abusive. My great uncle Ed, which was one of his 10 children, had lumps on his head from beatings that he had as a child from his father. There's an article in the New York Times. My Uncle Ed runs to the court and says, "Protect me from my father," and he's 10 years old, and that's written up in the New York Times. And Edwin goes to court and says, "Oh, that's not true. He fell off his bike. He was on his wheel, and those scars, they're from a fight he got into in the neighborhood." And the judge believes him. My boy's wild. I have to curb him. So he's rebellious, and this goes on and on like this. Bottom line, he got away with way too much. People didn't charge him when he stole stuff from them. They didn't press charges. Prosecutors didn't press charges.
So that kind of implies that he had something going. I mean, the ability to fool people, I guess, but at the same time, you mentioned there were letters of reference and things like that.
Yeah, he had an act down that he couldn't fool everybody. There are newspaper quotes where people just say, this guy is not all he pretends to be, a shyster or a braggart. They don't believe his stories.
This is real reminiscent of some other things we talked about off camera. It reminds me of a movie, Catch Me If You Can, the way he
exactly.
put himself in front of people.
This is the forerunner of Catch Me If You Can. In Catch Me If You Can, millions of dollars were stolen, were taken illegally, and people's lives were put in jeopardy for somebody that wasn't licensed to fly a plane or practice medicine. This is the same with this person.
If he was alive today, what do you think he'd be doing?
He would be in jail for sure. He wouldn't have gotten, he commits murder, he gets 2 years for killing 2 people.
No, he wouldn't be in politics then.
No. It's amazing that, for instance, when he leaves Australia, he goes to New Zealand, and the police gazette that he's written up in Australia gets to New Zealand, so people, here's that guy. Although he uses Turner and Oswald Destin interchangeably, and he had another alias, Shaughnessy. But at times people caught up to him, and then what he'd do is skip town. It's everything from here's an advertisement, a book he wrote on massage. A brownstone he lived in New York, family pictures. He always lied on government forms. So here is his application for U.S. citizenship that is untruthful. Here, his marriage license, which is doctored. One of his lectures. Henry Ward Beecher performs the ceremony, but his wife is already pregnant. So to hide he changes on the marriage license from May, when they got married in 1880. He changes it to March because she's with child. To reduce any possible scandal, if anybody's counting months. So we researched where was Henry Ward Beecher, who conducted the famous pastor. Where was Henry Ward Beecher on March 16th, 1880? He was not in New York City.
So you think this is a forged document too?
Yeah, he changed it. He was in Ohio. I mean, that's the kind of research, fact-checking that we did. And all through this book, even the articles, the glowing articles in the New York Times, Nobody ever really fact-checked. They did not put the time into it. People reported him in New York City, and he had warrants upstate New York, and they didn't bother to come down and get him. He was arrested in Canada, and the town that he was wanted in New York didn't have the money to go up to Canada and bring him back. So a private citizen who had been robbed ends up providing the funds for the police department to go and get him and bring him back, and then he ends up in jail for a bit, but then he skips bail. It just goes on and on,
Really?
and on, constantly breaking jail.
How did he die?
I don't want to give that away.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So all the more reason for us to get the book.
It's interesting end. Let me just say that.
Okay. I know that you've been a teacher, you've been involved in schools, that we've got the reading programs here in Southfield that we're real proud of. For you, what's been the value of reading? How did it weave into your life, your enjoyment, your job? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, as a kid, I've always, to me, history, some people think history's boring. I always found it fascinating. And I look at history as just a collection of life stories. And we all have lives and stories. So I'm always very interested in other people's stories. And to a degree, as a kid, I used to, the Johnson Public Library in Hackensack was a very interesting brownstone building, Victorian, and built by, forgetting his first name, but Mr. Johnson, and Hackensack was a philanthropist. And so he built this library. Anyhow, it had wonderful windows and window seats. And I used to just go to the library, and arches in the children's section on the top floor. And I used to just go up there and read. And it was, in a way, it was an escape. Some kids, would go out and be playing baseball. I preferred to read. And I just found it always very fascinating. So I've always been a reader. And I do Southfield history talks, and I encourage the kids to read. The kids are always very impressed that I've written books. And I talk to them about you've got to put the television down, you've got to put the games down, spend some time reading. And also I talk to them about writing. Because for a lot of children, writing isn't something they always gravitate to, and more or less if they're asked to write something, they just want to write it and hand it in and be done with it. And I keep telling them, you have to rewrite. You have to think about, could you find a way to say that better? Could you find a way to, put some action words into it that might be better descriptors? As a journalism teacher, I always used to tell my junior high and high school students, don't tell me, show me. Through your words, show me. Do not tell me. And that's hard.
Is there anything you want to add that I'm not asking you?
No, I just appreciate this opportunity to tell a little bit of this story. I am really reconciled with his bad behavior, his personality disorder, and I think it's a story worth telling. And somebody said, well, are you sure you want to tell this story? Doesn't it make you look bad? And I said, no, I'm my own person. I don't have that reputation. And we're all different. So this was very definitely one of those relatives that families have that we're not particularly proud of, but in this case, it is a fascinating story of how he, his human behavior and getting away with more than any person should.
Well, thank you for sharing this story with us. And I wish you some success selling the book. Again, if people want to find it, it's on Amazon.
Right.
It's available in our library.
There's a copy here that I donated to the library, and it's at Book Beat in Oak Park.
Very good. Well, Ken, thanks so much for your time today. It's a pleasure talking to you. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.